Realize it, Erie's an important sport fishery. Obviously, people come from all over, and one of the most recent estimates says that retail sales in Ohio that come from Great Lakes fishing, which obviously is Erie, are almost $500 million a year annually. That's a big number. I don't know how they calculate it, but it just goes to show how important Lake Erie is, obviously. And one of the things we've been doing lately with our creel survey is asking the people that we interview what their zip code is. Each one of these numbers up here represents an answer on one interview, not all the anglers, but one group of anglers interviewed. For the 2008 season, we had people that called their home Alaska, California, Texas, Florida. People come from all over to fish this lake. And you can, as you might imagine, most of it's Ohio and the Midwest, but pretty interesting fishery that I'm privileged enough to work on. Sometimes these slides get my attention. I get pretty focused in on Erie and just, thinking of Erie as status quo. We clearly have the biggest walleye fishery in the Great Lakes and most likely in the world. If you add up all the Great Lakes other than Erie, they harvest less than, in most years, less than 2 million pounds total. In Lake Erie, we've harvested as many as 18 million pounds of walleye lake-wide. This kind of puts this Lake Erie's walleye fishery in perspective. Even our worst years, we harvest 3 times more than the rest of the Great Lakes combined, based on creel surveys of harvest. This includes commercial fishing. This is all harvest, and this is all harvest from other lakes. So everything else I talked about is going to be Ohio waters of Lake Erie. We have a very large creel survey. If you're not familiar with what we do, we actually survey from April through October the entire shoreline of Ohio waters of Lake Erie. And every year we estimate all effort and harvest from all Ohio waters, and even waters outside of Ohio for boats returning to Ohio's ports to fish somewhere else. On this computer, I did have a little bit of an issue of some numbers disappearing on the bottom. I think you should be able to still get the gist of everything based on what's up here. So apologize for anything that happens to be off the screen. For this first time I've used this computer for this presentation. We estimate all angler hours every year. So from 1980 through, this runs through this year, 2009. We've estimated as many as almost 12 million angler hours that were spent fishing in Lake Erie's Ohio waters. And I didn't break this up by charter and private to demean the charter fishery at all. The charter fishery is very important. It gets a lot of people out that couldn't otherwise get out. They teach a lot of people how to fish. And they're an important part of the fishery. But I did want to point out that our private boat fishery, anyone that says they aren't a charter, accounts for over 90% of the hours every year annually. We had years when the charter fishery made up as many as 17% of the hours. Recently, it's around 10% of the hours. And as you might imagine, we had a lot of effort back in the 80s, back in the heyday when a lot of people were fishing. We still average close to 4 million angler hours a year. That's a huge number if you look at any other fisheries, regionally or across the country. So how are these hours made up? What do we fish for? Well, as you might imagine, you look at the blue and the green, the walleye and yellow perch. It's a walleye yellow perch fishery. There's other stuff to fish for. We do have targeted smallmouth hours and people fishing for things like white bass or channel cat or other things, or even just anything that bites, that would count up there. But basically, recently we're about half and half walleye and perch hours. The tougher walleye years, perch become a little more important. The better walleye years, walleye become more important. You can see how it's kind of changed since the 80s. In the 80s, we were a walleye fishery, bar none. We fished for walleye in the 80s. Now we fish for a good mix of walleye and perch. So how many walleye do we harvest? I showed you the pounds lake-wide. This is number of walleye harvested in millions from Ohio waters of Lake Erie, both charter and private fisheries combined. We harvested as many as almost 5 million walleye out of Ohio waters of Lake Erie back in the 80s. That's kind of hard to even fathom, but that's the way it was back then. A lot of people were interested in fishing, and there were a lot of fish out there. Recently, we've been about a 1 million fish fishery since the late 90s. Had a couple of bigger years for around 2 million with the 03 year class that I'll talk about in a little bit. But we're a 1 to 2 million fish fishery recently with the amount of effort we've had and with the catch rates we have. To put in perspective, we do harvest more perch than walleye. These dots got a little blown out of proportion on this computer, but we've harvested as many as 12 million yellow perch in 1 year. And recently we harvested around 5 to 6 million yellow perch, which is quite a bit more than walleye. But of course that's by numbers. If you look at it by weight, we still primarily harvest walleye. Obviously, average weight is much higher on walleye, and when you get big fish like the 03s are now, you harvest a lot of pounds in walleye, even though the perch numbers are higher. One of the most interesting things we've seen, and a lot of people in this room are responsible for it, is the change from casting to trolling. I don't think you'll see a change like this in fishing method in any fishery this size anywhere. The bars are the targeted hours that relate hours targeted at walleye, so people that told us they were fishing for walleye. So that's the gray bars in millions relative to this, the x-axis on the left, the y-axis on the left. The lines are percent of hours spent casting versus trolling. That's not always 100% because we don't always get an answer out of every walleye fisherman, every walleye angler. But the secondary y-axis is percent of each method. We were a 70% casting fishery, and that's lake-wide. That's not Western Basin, that's Toledo to Conneaut. 70% of the hours a year were spent casting for 70% of the walleye hours. In the last 10 years, it's been a complete switch. We're approaching 70% of the hours by trollers, and we're getting down towards 35% of the hours by casters. Pretty amazing switch considering how big of a fishery this is, but it's no surprise why that is. Even when we had more casters and trollers, if you look at the harvest rate per hour for people targeting walleye, every single year, trollers have caught more per hour than casters, even when trollers were in the minority. And I don't say that to knock casters or to say you shouldn't cast. If you enjoy casting, you should go out there and cast. And if you look in 2005, you were over half a fish per hour harvested casting. Even in 05, or 06, excuse me, it'd be 06, when the 03s were 3 years old. You can still catch a lot of fish casting, but look what happened in 2008. The 2009 effort summary isn't done yet, so this is 2008. There was a 0.2 fish per hour difference between casters and trollers. That might not sound like a big deal, but if you look at harvest rate, this is harvest rate, not just catch rate. If you look at harvest rate, any fishery in the Midwest would be ecstatic to have a 0.2 fish per hour harvest rate for their fishery. We have a 0.2 fish per hour difference in casters and trollers. So I handed out these tables earlier, and if you didn't get one, there's a stack here. Feel free to come up and grab one from the